Something difficult that I had to come to terms with in my own recovery and what I share with everyone I work with is that addiction isn't your fault and it is your responsibility. Addiction comes from somewhere. It didn't just pop up overnight. None of us chose it, and it doesn't show up in perfectly happy, healthy, connected, well-functioning human beings. That's not fair. None of this is fair. None of this is fair. Let me just say that right now. Whether you're a person who struggles with addiction or connected to one, none of it's fair. The whole thing is bullshit. Believe me, I understand that. That can be maddening. It can be frustrating. It can be disheartening. It is what it is. If you are experiencing addiction, you are in one of the most unfair situations a person can go through in life. It is not your fault, and it is your responsibility. There are generally two ways that people find themselves in active addiction. Part of it is genetic. We do know that there is a genetic component to addiction, which means that it can be passed down from family to family. Now, there's not an addiction gene or an allergy like they used to call it almost 100 years ago when 12-step came into the mix. It really is a pattern in the brain and chemicals and all sorts of different things happening in the brain, as we talked about in the last section, that can be passed down genetically. So there is that component, which really just means that someone could be predispositioned for addiction. It doesn't mean if you come from people with addiction that you're definitely going to have it, or vice versa. But there is a genetic component. So we're just going to call that out. Again, not your fault, but here we are. So it is your responsibility. Most people, I won't say all people, but most people who grow up to have active addiction have some form or forms of trauma in their early life. That can be really big trauma, like abuse or neglect of any kind. That can be sexual abuse, which is really common. Again, not fair, but it's really common for people with sex addiction to have sexual abuse in their childhood. I know that doesn't make a ton of sense, because why would we turn to the thing that's seemingly the problem for the cure? But it's really, really common. Could be physical, emotional, spiritual abuse, could be mental abuse. It could be neglect, just not being cared for at all. Those are some of the larger, or what they call big T traumas, that can show up in someone's early life that later turn into active addiction. That usually actually starts pretty young. By the time people find themselves at a place of this being super problematic and coming into recovery, or being at a point of suicide, or just life is a mess, is later on in adulthood. But addiction really doesn't start there. It tends to start as a adaptation of the brain for our circumstances. So I'll share with you a little bit of my history and what happened that was really the catalyst for this showing up later on in life in such a big way. Now, I do come from a long history of people with addiction. So yes, there was that predisposition genetically that I too would experience addiction. Now, I kind of came into trauma from the get-go. My dad was actively engaged in addiction. He was very unwell in all ways and was not showing up as a good father or a good husband in our family. So there was abuse happening from a very early age that I was around for. My parents split, which was a really great thing at that time. And now I have abandonment stuff thrown in the mix, right? Because I'm very young and I don't understand. where dad is or what's happening, or is it my fault? All of that stuff. Later, I was reintroduced to my dad. And at about 5 years old is when sexual abuse came into the mix. That initially started as grooming. So comments, touches, things that were inappropriate, but slowly building up to full-blown sexual abuse. And pornography got introduced at that time as well. I won't share a lot of details on that, but for me, this started at 5, and it carried on for the next few years with both covert and overt sexual abuse from my dad. The brain can't handle that. Any type of trauma creates a shift in how the brain develops and how it functions. Now, keep in mind, as we discussed in that brain section, its number one job is to keep us alive. So it does what it needs to do in order to keep us alive and keep us functioning. So a person's brain who has gone through trauma actually looks very different than a person who has not experienced trauma. But I'll tell you, those brains are probably getting harder and harder to find. But the brain itself actually adapts through altering the neurotransmitters, what's received and what's put out with regard to brain chemicals in order to keep a person alive and functioning. Because there was a deplete in brain chemicals, I sought out a way to increase them. Again, that reward system that we talked about. I have a perceived threat. Something does not feel good. I want to alter the feeling. I discovered at a young age that sexual activity or fantasy could do that. But then also there is shame and anxiety tied into that, which then clicked on that survival instinct, that perceived threat. They got wired together, and my brain actually formed from a early age into having this pattern. These, as they say, fire together, wire together. So that started happening. And then we get that cycle that you might be familiar with, where you don't have pleasant feelings. So you engage in sexual behavior of whatever kind to feel better, and it works for a time. But then you feel bad because of it, which again clicks on that system. And here we go on this really ugly, unpleasant spiral that only gets worse and worse. So trauma, in that big sense, creates those alterations in the brain as a way to stay alive. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just how it works. And over time, when we keep putting that in there, we're really just telling the brain, hey, this is super important. And the brain goes, awesome, I got it. I'm built for efficiency. So let me go ahead and make some shortcuts here. I'll just make the necessary adjustments so that you can survive and live in this state with the information that's being put in. Over time, when we keep that system going, it becomes compulsive. Now we're not really in the conscious mix anymore. It's just happening in the brain and we're responding accordingly. And you might be familiar with that with triggers happening. And then all of a sudden you're on autopilot and there doesn't seem to be anything you can do about it until you heal the brain. There kind of isn't. We'll talk more about that later. Don't worry, there's hope. But that's because there's a system, there's a program, and it's running in your brain, and it's been there, and it's told that it's important, and now it's compulsive. And when it moves from compulsive to that criteria we talked about before, now we're talking about active addiction. There's also what they call little t trauma. So those are things like not feeling like you're good enough, not feeling lovable, like there's something wrong with you. Maybe you were shamed as a kiddo for who you are or how you were showing up in the world. Maybe you got caught engaged in some behavior that your family didn't find acceptable and you were shamed for it and you were punished or humiliated for it. Those things can also create trauma. Now, let's pause for a second, because when we're young, and this stuff usually does happen while we're young, we are completely helpless. We rely on our guardians, whether that's family or whatever your system is, whatever you perceive to be guardians, we rely on them entirely for our survival when we are children. So anything can feel like a threat to our survival when we're kids, and that gets interpreted over time as trauma. It's really not as uncommon as we once thought, or as maybe we like to think now. You might recognize that feeling not good enough now as an adult isn't really a life or death thing. But take it back to childhood, where your survival depends on you being accepted. And now you perceive you're not acceptable. That's a threat to your survival when you're a kid in your brain. And that gets processed as trauma, and the brain changes accordingly. Then our actions follow suit. On top of all of that, when we experience trauma, whether it's big or little, whether it is one really big significant event or something happening consistently over time that makes us feel like our lives are being threatened, we see the world differently. We see ourselves differently. I was given the message through my father's behavior that I did not have value outside of my body. I didn't have value outside of what someone could take from me. And I lived my life according to that message. Because again, I'm going to keep bringing it back. When this stuff is developing, we are children. We're young. We don't know what we know now. We don't have a fully developed brain the way that we do now, or that we're working towards now. Our world is very small. Our perception is all self-focused, which is fine. That's how it's supposed to be. And we really are relying on those around us to care for us. So these things might not seem like a big deal to us now, though some certainly do. But as children, they mean everything. And childhood just happens to be when our brain is developing. So this stuff is kind of baked in. Not permanent, but baked in when we are experiencing trauma at an early age, or potentially any age. It just usually happens at that young age. So what we're talking about is a perceived threat to our survival, either in a big way or happening consistently over time. Add in the predisposition with genetics, and now you have someone who in time, this coping mechanism turns into compulsion and turns into active addiction. So that's the trauma model. That's really, really common. It's not uncommon for people in recovery to think that they had perfectly happy childhoods, that everything was great, or that their trauma or what happened to them isn't as big as other people, so it shouldn't have affected them. Let me tell you, I don't know if you've ever stubbed your toe, but I'm guessing you have, and it hurt like hell. Now someone else has lost an entire leg. Does that make your toe hurt any less? No, it still hurts to stub one's toe. It doesn't matter what other people have experienced. It doesn't matter if there's bigger things or things that seem worse than your experience. If you as a child, little you, sweet little innocent perfect kiddo you, perceived a threat to their existence, which all things can be perceived that way when we're kiddos, then it's possible that this malfunctioning of the brain started at that point in your development, which also results in us being stunted in our development. We show up in the world very differently. We look at ourselves very differently. We're in a space of that chronic stress, which just keeps that cycle rocking over and over again. And here we are in active addiction as adults later. That's not your fault. There's nothing you could have done about it. It's not your fault. And now as an adult, it is your responsibility. Make sense? There's another area that can lead into addiction as well, another avenue, if you will, and that is through use itself. There's a caveat to this, but let's talk about use itself. So if you're inputting stimuli into your brain that then has that reward process happen, so say watching pornography, which the brain has not evolved to do, mind you. So that is a lot of intensity coming in all at one time, stimulating those hedonic hotspots, getting into that mix with all of the areas that get turned on when sexual activity is in the mix. Now, doing that over and over and over and over and over is telling the brain, this is important. This is high priority stuff here. It creates those shortcuts, fired together, wired together. It then thinks this is our highest priority. This is tied to the most important things because the brain is designed that way already. Only now we're pushing that button all the time pushing that button in the brain, and it becomes compulsive, and in time can become active addiction as well. Now, that being said, I have never met a person, talked with a person, worked with a person who had this wonderful, healthy life that then turned to using, whether that was a behavior or a substance. So yes, with regard to the brain, overuse can result in addiction. It's just a rewiring of the brain. Again, let's keep in mind, addiction is a malfunctioning of the brain. That's all we're talking about here. So using something consistently and then compulsively can become addiction. It is worth looking at what is going on in life before that led to that kind of use. Now, it could also be, like me, pornography was introduced at a very young age, which also is a form of trauma, I think. We're not equipped to receive that type of content, especially what's coming out nowadays, depending on your age. It's very different than probably when I was a child or certainly the generation before. But that is an overstimulation of the brain, and the brain can't handle it. So it then creates a totally different process of the brain in order to maintain our survival. Its number one job, keep you alive. So if it's being overstimulated, completely overwhelmed by the chemicals and the processes that go into effect when we consume, whether that's pornography or phone sex or sexting or fantasy or actually engaging in sexual behaviors one-on-one or in groups, whatever, when we're doing that so much, it is changing the brain because the brain can't handle that. So it's a whole different form of trauma and in a way kind of an abuse to the brain as it just totally overwhelms it. So those are the avenues that we usually see with addiction: early childhood trauma or excessive use consistently that has actually changed the brain. Caveat, still look to the past because there's likely something going on that then resulted in the overuse. But those are the areas, the avenues, the paths at which people tend to find themselves in addiction. It is not your fault, and it is your responsibility. We're going to talk about that in our next section, which is about recovery and what can we actually do with this area of addiction we've found ourselves in. So I'll see you over there.